The origins and nature of self-concept. What is the self-concept and how does it develop? Cultural influences on the self-concept. Functions of self. Who are you? How did you come to be this person you call myself? A good place to begin is with the question of whether we are the only species that has a self. Although it is doubtful that other species can think of themselves as unique beings in the same way that we do, some fascinating studies suggest that other species have at least a rudimentary sense of self. To study whether animals have self-concept, researchers placed a mirror in an animal's cage until the mirror became a familiar object. The animals were then briefly anesthetized, and an odorless red dye was painted on its brow or ear. What happened when the animal woke up and looked in the mirror? Members of the great ape family, such as chimpanzees or orangutans, immediately touched the area on their heads marked with a red spot, whereas apes such as gibbons did not. These studies suggest that chimps and orangutans have a rudimentary sense of self. They realize that the image in the mirror is themselves and not another animal, and they recognize that they look different from how they looked before. What about other animals? Individual members of other species have passed the mirror test, including 2 dolphins, 1 Asian elephant, and 2 magpies. But no other non-human species regularly passes the test other than great apes. Wondering when a sense of self develops in humans, researchers used a variation of red dye test with toddlers and found that human self-recognition develops around 18 to 24 months of age. Then, as we grow older, this rudimentary sense of self develops into a full-blown self-concept, defined as the overall set of beliefs that people have about their personal attributes. One way psychologists have studied how people's self-concept changes from childhood to adulthood is by asking people of different ages to answer the simple question, who am I? Typically, a child's self-concept is concrete, with references to clear-cut, easy observable characteristics like age, sex, neighborhood, and hobbies. A 9-year-old answered the question this way: I have brown eyes, I have brown hair, I have brown eyebrows, I'm a boy, I have an uncle that is almost 7 feet tall. As we mature, we place less emphasis on physical characteristics and more on psychological states, our thoughts and feelings, and on considerations of how other people judge us. Consider this 12th grade high school student's answer to the question, who am I? Begin quote, I'm a human being. I'm a moody person. I'm an indecisive person. I'm an ambitious person. I'm a very curious person. I am not an individual. I am a loner. I'm an American. I am a Democrat. I'm a liberal person. I'm a radical. I'm a conservative. I'm a pseudo-liberal. I'm an atheist. I'm a not classifiable person. End quote. Clearly, this teenager has moved well beyond descriptions of her hobbies and appearance. What do we see as key attributes of the self when we are adults? To answer that question, imagine that you had a good friend when you were 25, but lost track of this person and didn't see him or her again until 40 years later. You notice that your friend has changed in certain ways, and the question is, how do these changes alter your view of the person's true self? A recent study asked participants this question and found that some changes, such as physical declines, minor cognitive deficits, and new preferences, don't change people's basic view of who someone is. If our friend Bob now needs prescription eyeglasses, doesn't recall things as well as he used to, and has become a vegetarian, we still see him as the same old Bob. But if an old friend has undergone a moral transformation, for example, if Bob shows signs of cruelty when he used to be kind, or racist when he used to be egalitarian, we hardly recognize him as the same person. In short, morality is viewed as central to self-concept, more so than cognitive processes or desires. New heading: cultural influences on self-concept. An important influence on our self-concept is the culture in which we grew up. Consider Misako Awada, a crown princess in Japan. When she married Crown Prince Naruhito in June 1993, at age 29, she was a brilliant career diplomat in the foreign ministry, educated at Harvard and Oxford. She spoke 5 languages and was on the fast track to a prestigious job as a diplomat. Her decision to marry the prince surprised many observers because it meant she would have to give up her career. Indeed, she gave up any semblance of an independent life, becoming subservient to the prince and the rest of the royal family, and spending much of her time participating in rigid royal ceremonies. Although some people hoped that she would modernize the monarchy, the princess has not changed the imperial family as much as it has changed her. How do you feel about Misako's decision to marry the prince? Your answer may say something about the nature of your self-concept and the culture in which you grow up. In many Western cultures, people have an independent view of self, which in a way is defining oneself in terms of one's own internal thoughts, feelings, and actions, and not in terms of the thoughts, feelings, and actions of others. Consequently, many Western observers were mystified by Misako's decision to marry the crown prince. They assumed that she was coerced into marriage by a backward, sexist society that did not properly value her worth as an individual with an independent life of her own. In contrast, many Asian and other non-Western cultures have an interdependent view of self, which is a way of defining oneself in terms of one's relationships to other people and recognizing that one's behavior is often determined by thoughts, feelings, and actions of others. Here, connectedness and interdependence between people are valued, whereas independence and uniqueness are frowned on. For example, when asked to complete sentences beginning with I am, people from Asian cultures are more likely to refer to social groups, such as their family or religious group, than people from Western cultures are. To many Japanese and other Asians, Misako's decision to give up her career was not at all surprising and was a natural consequence of her view of herself as connected and obligated to others, such as her parents and the royal family. What is viewed as positive and normal behavior by one culture may be viewed very different by another. Ted Singalius, developed a questionnaire that measures the extent to which people view themselves as interdependent or independent. Studies generally show that people who live in East Asian countries agree more with the interdependence items, whereas those who live in Western countries agree more with the independence items. We do not mean to imply, however, that every member of a Western culture has an independent view of self, and that every member of an Asian culture has an interdependent view of self. In the United States, for example, people who live in states that were settled more recently by European Americans, such as Oklahoma and Utah, tend to have a more independent view of self than do people who live in more settled East Coast states, such as Massachusetts and Connecticut. One sign of this, according to a recent study, is that babies born in recently settled states have more unusual names than babies born in other states. That is one sign of independent self-construal, is giving your baby an unusual name. And parents are more likely to do that in states such as Oklahoma than they are in states such as Connecticut. The same difference was found in recently settled versus older areas of Canada. For example, states like Massachusetts, one of the first established states, have a high percentage of the top baby names for males and females. Same thing with Connecticut. Alabama was settled about less than 50 years later than those states, and they're about the same. As were states as Kansas, Utah, and Oklahoma were settled almost 100 years later. They have more unusual names for their kids. They don't have the top selected names in the U.S. at such a high clip. Nonetheless, the difference between the Western and Eastern sense of self is real and has interesting consequences for communication between the cultures. Indeed, the differences in the sense of self are so fundamental that it is very difficult for people with independent selves to appreciate what it is like to have an interdependent self, and vice versa. After giving a lecture on the Western view of the self to a group of Japanese students, one psychologist reported that the students sighed deeply and said at the end, "Could this really be true?" To paraphrase William Shakespeare, in the Western society, the self is the measure of all things. But however natural we consider this conception of self to be, it is important to remember that it is socially constructed and therefore may differ from culture to culture. New heading: Functions of self. What exactly does the self do? There are four main functions of self. Self-knowledge is the way we understand who we are and formulate and organize this information. Self-control is the way we make plans and execute decisions, such as your decision to read this book right now instead of going out for ice cream. Impression management is the way we present ourselves to other people and get them to see us the way we want to be seen. And self-esteem is the way in which we try to maintain positive views of ourselves. In the remainder of this chapter, we will discuss all four of these functions.